We're going to be looking at just called You Got to Serve Somebody, and we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 3 on that issue. But there's many places in Scripture that would talk about this. One of the passages that talks about, by the way, Phil read the passage from 1 Kings that just set it up perfectly. Baal or God? So that's kind of the issue that's there, and he read that, and we're thankful for that. But in Deuteronomy 30, verse 20, it says this, or by 19, he says this, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. So there's the choice. God says, I've called together all the authority of heaven and earth, and here's the choice. Choose life or choose death. So it's a message that's found all the way through Scripture, and what we do with that, are we going to choose life, death, or are we going to choose the way of the world? We're going to choose God's way is the issue that we want to look at today. So we're going to look at this passage in Daniel chapter 3. Many of you are no doubt familiar with it. It's a time in which we see some familiar kind of Sunday school stories that pop out at us. But this is more than just a Sunday school story. It's where there's a guy named Nebuchadnezzar. He's the ruler of the Babylonian Empire, the greatest group of people, the most powerful group of people on the earth at that time. Nobody bigger, better than the Babylonian Empire. And if you recall in the background in chapter 2, chapter 3 obviously comes from the tales of chapter 2. Chapter 2 had been when he had a dream. Remember, these young men that we saw last week been taken captive from Israel, brought to Babylon, and they'd been made to be part of the king's advisors, training them to be advisors to the king and all the ways of the Babylonian Empire and culture. So he comes before them and he says, I had a dream. And I want you guys to interpret this dream for me. So the magicians and all the ones again say, okay, tell us a dream and we'll interpret it. No. You tell me the dream. You tell me what I dreamed, then you tell me what it meant. And remember, they said, we can't do that. I mean, we don't read your mind. He said, well, that's kind of what you're paid to do. So if you can't do that, off with your heads. So he ordered them all to be killed. The word got to Daniel, who was one of the ones that had been trained in this kind of realm, and he said, well, get word to the king that there is one that can interpret this king, and that's the God of heaven. So remember that he brought Daniel in, and Daniel said, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what would take place in the latter days. So he came in and explained and said, King, here was your dream. You dreamt that there was this great statue. And this great statue was made up of, as you could see in your dream, it had a head of gold, then had a chest and arms of silver, and had a belly and thighs made of bronze, and at the bottom had 2 feet, and there was a mixture of clay and iron. How's that? And they were, well, that's exactly their dream. That's what it was. Now, what does it mean? And you remember Daniel said, you, O king, are the head of gold. And then there will be succeeding empires or kingdoms that will come after you. And the rest of that dream is that there was a great rock that came out of nowhere, a great stone that hadn't been cut out with hands. And that great stone came crashing through the air and crashed into this statue in your dream, completely demolished it, blew it to smithereens so that it was no more. And the stone then grew and became a great empire. So the rest of your dream is that this is a dream about the coming empires of the world. And he says, if you're the gold, he said, there'll be other empires that come after you. And I'm not going to get into that today, but many people would say that coming after that is a very clear indication that would come next to the Medo-Persian Empire. Then there would come the Greek Empire. Then would come the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was, eventually divided and fell apart. All of these kingdoms, he says, will eventually be obliterated by the stone which comes out of the sky, will grow into a kingdom of God forever. And that's God's kingdom. So that's basically the prophetic implications of chapter 2. Now, the problem was Nebuchadnezzar only heard the first part. You are the head of gold. Oh, really? I'm bad. I'm the head of gold. That's what he thought. This one went to his head, and he said, isn't that incredible? I am the head of gold. And he no doubt had this run around his head for a number of years, because we know between chapter 2 and chapter 3, there's approximately 23 years that take place. So as chapter 3 opens up, we find 23 years later, we find that he begins to make some application of that. It says, there's a Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width was 60 cubits. And he set it in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, it's interesting, at the end of chapter 2, after Daniel had interpreted this dream for Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar thought that was a pretty big deal. And he said, whoever revealed this to you must be the God. So he ends up chapter 2 by telling Daniel, he said, Daniel, the king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and the Lord of lords and revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. And then he promoted Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to positions of power in the Babylonian Empire. So that's the backdrop. Then he has this other thing that comes along. So this is not a dream. So he's thinking about this for all this time. Finally said, that's a pretty heady thing. So I tell you what, I am going to erect a statue. And this time it's not just a head of gold. And he said the whole thing's going to be gold. So he erects the statue 60 cubits high, which is roughly, say, 90 feet. So I don't know if you can picture 90 feet is probably, 2 or 3 times as high as this building, okay? 90 feet high statue of him. And we know that that's true. There have been many archaeological discoveries in the land of Iraq, which is what Babylon was at that time. And we know that they've discovered many things that relate to this particular time. We also know that Babylon was a great kingdom. We know that the city of Babylon, where Nebuchadnezzar lived at that time and ruled, was 15 square miles. Okay, so can you picture, I don't know, the area well enough to know what's 15 miles down the freeway this way? Probably into Fairfield, maybe further. 15 square miles, that's the city of Babylon. We know that around the city of Babylon there was a wall. That wall was 350 feet high, 250 watchtowers around this whole building, the whole wall. We know that wall was 87 feet thick. These have been almost exact measurements given down through time, and some of the remnants of this has been found. 87 feet thick, which means you could raise 6 chariots across the top of this wall. So when we look at this, we kind of think, well, this is just ancient history, a bunch of people back in time that really didn't have much going for them. You look at any artist rendering of what the city of Babylon was like, it was an incredible, incredible city. It would almost rival anything architecture that we have today. The only thing, they didn't have electricity, and that was about the only difference. Some of the buildings they had were absolutely incredible. So you look at that and you say, well, why did he do this? What was he trying to do? Well, it's not hard for us to realize what was going on. It was a demonstration of his pride. We know that in chapter 4, which we'll get into a little bit in the next couple of weeks, as time began to up, he had another dream about a tree that popped up and showed his own finite nature. But we said that we find there in chapter 4, verse 30, he says, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself has built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my name? So we understand that he had a big ego. We understand that even though he had given verbal assent to Daniel's God, and said he's the true God of heaven who can interpret dreams, we understand now he really didn't believe that. He thought he was kind of the cheese that was more important than everybody else. So what he's doing here in building this statue, he's making this majestic image of himself, and what he's doing, he's deifying himself, deifying man. He's almost making himself out to be God. And it's interesting, if you look at what was going on there, we understand that there's, I don't think any coincidence by saying it was 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. 6, I don't know if you want to get that much into numerology, but 6 we know from Scripture is what's called the number of man. We know there were 6 days in creation, and on the 6th day man was created. In Revelation 19, talking about the coming times that are still yet future for us, talking about the Antichrist, John wrote there, here's wisdom, man, him who has understanding, calculate the number of the beast, For the number of that is of a man, and his number is what? Remember, 666. So there's some kind of indication there, even in the dimension of the statue, this is a deification of man himself. Now we look at that and we say, well, is that too different than today? Do we look at that and just say, well, it's just a nice story? Here's I think part of the way that we interpret Old Testament stories like this. They're not just there for historical purposes. They're there for us to understand some of the nature not only of God, but to understand the nature of man. What was going on here was a thing that mankind and all different empires and kings and potentates and presidents and everybody have done since then, is the tendency to deify themselves and make themselves, the most important people ever walked the face of this earth. Some, especially in the Roman times, even literally said that they were God in the flesh, deified themselves in a way that would lead others to believe this. They bow down almost like they're God themselves. Now we look at that and say, well, how has that gone through the ages? I'm not trying to do a large scale history lesson here, but even when we come today, we think, how has that worked for mankind over the years? We come today and we look at the technology that we have. We live in quite a technological age, don't we? But you look at how has that happened? Has man done anything that really advances society? I suggest the only thing that man has done is invent different technologies. That's all he's done. We live in a technological age with not only the internet, with all the marvels that we have with the advent of discovery of electricity. So we have lights, we have gas-powered cars, we have all the technology that's available to us. But have we really solved the problems of man? Think about how great man is, and we say, look at who we are, what we've done. We understand something about the breadth of the solar system, right? And yet we think how great. We've only gotten to one little moon. That's all we've done. That's it. We're just one little speck in this galaxy, and we know that there are thousands of galaxies out there. Pat ourselves on the back, something we've got to one little moon. We know that mankind has not eradicated disease. Oh, we've conquered some of them. I mean, with vaccines, we can conquer measles, mumps, things like that, but we haven't conquered disease. Cancer still with us. People still have heart attacks. You go on and on. We haven't conquered disease. We look at all that's happened on the face of this earth today, and we can't even feed almost 2/3 of the earth. We haven't solved wars. So we look at this idea to deify man and say how great man is. And well, man is not as great as he thinks he is. But here was a man who thought that he was great. We have to remember that when we come to times like this, God says something about people like this. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 24 says this, all flesh is like grass. So the workings of mankind, what mankind comes up with, all the accomplishments of man that we look up and say, look who we are. Look at our skyscrapers, look at our automobiles, look at our planes, look at our jets. Look at everything we've done. What does God think of that? God thinks, well, isn't that wonderful? All flesh is like grass, and all its glory is like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls off. That's what I think of your technology. There's nothing wrong with technology, nothing wrong with even advancing the ease with which we live, but is God impressed with that? No. So when we look at mankind saying how great man is, we must realize that then we can look back in the tendency, well, they didn't know what they're talking about. Now, when we get to our time, look who we are. My friend, let me just suggest we're no different from what they were then. Only thing that's changed is technology. We haven't solved these basic problems. So Nebuchadnezzar comes on with this great, great statue, deifying himself and deifying all that he is, this great, big, egotistical statue that he built. So now, what's the response to that? The response is interesting. Everyone flocks to this huge statue. It says there were 7 distinct categories that came. If you look at the passage there in Daniel chapter 3, it says there were satraps, there were prefects, there was a governor. These are just different layers of governmental officials. Leaders of the different provinces like governors, supervisors, like county supervisors, that kind of thing in our context. There were counselors who were these magicians. There were the treasurers, these would obviously handle the money, the judges, the magistrates. So all of these people, it's almost like an all-inclusive cattle call. So I built this huge statue. Now everybody who is anybody in the Babylonian culture, they all come and say, wow, all together now, 1, 2, 3, wow. That was the idea. Let's get everybody to come together and see how wonderful this man Nebuchadnezzar is. And so we look at that and say, well, okay, we might be impressed if we saw the statue, but again, you can bring together all the government officials, all the kings, all the presidents, all the supervising, all the judging, brings together the whole remnant of our society. It might be equivalent if these come and say, well, people can come and say, wow, look at man. There's a tendency that man has to want to worship himself. And that's what was happening there. So he's not only bringing all these people together, but he's also coming to elevate man. You think of what we see in Scripture before in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, it says, God told the descendants of Noah, it says, to multiply and fill the earth. Now, what happened with that? Did they do that? If you read Genesis, you know they did not. After the flood, they went out and they started. But then a group of them got together, it says, on the plains of, you remember where? Babylon. This place right here. It's where they stopped. In Genesis 11:4, it said they disobeyed God and they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we'll be scattered about over the face of this whole earth. So that's exactly what they did. You can go to the Far East today and you can see some of the continuing examples. They're called ziggurats. Z-I-G-G-U-R-A-T. If you want to go online and look, you can still see some examples. They're like a tiered pyramid. So a tower to heaven, when you think of a tower, it wasn't a tower, it was like a huge ziggurat. It was a kind of scaled pyramid. That's what they did. Why did they do it? No, we don't want to obey God. We want to build a tower for ourselves. We're going to build this so high. Now, you think of how ludicrous this is. In their perspective, they're going to build this to heaven. And we look and said, are you kidding? Have you seen our skyscrapers? Now, I don't think we're trying to build skyscrapers to get to heaven, but we're just trying to build a monument. Look who we are. Look what we've done. And where are skyscrapers located, by the way? You have any skyscrapers in Vacaville? Nah. Walnut Creek, I happen to know, has a height limit of 29 feet. I know because when we built the sanctuary that we ran up against that. Why are skyscrapers only in big cities for the same thing? I know jobs and everything come there, but it's for mankind. That's where all the flower of mankind, that's where all the abilities, all the technology, all the collective wisdom of man is found is in the big cities. So we build these huge big buildings as a monument itself. Look who we are. Look what we've done. Look how sophisticated we are. That's part of the beginning of what was going on in Genesis. Here's another example of that. You know that the world will end for those empires? In Revelation chapter 18, verse 2, it says, and I cried out with a loud voice, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. In Revelation, the word Babylon seems to be an indicator of all of man's abilities. I don't think it's necessarily looking to the city of Babylon, but Babylon, it could be the exact city, but it's a symbol of all of man's achievements. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and faithful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality. If you want to find all that goes against God, you'll find it in the cities. Still today. The inner cities especially. But that's where it's all found. That's why God said, I don't want that. I don't want you to go and build these big cities, just monuments to yourself. Why? Because he didn't want them to depend upon him. Instead, we build these big cities and say how wonderful we are. So it goes on in Revelation, the nation have drunk of the wine, the passion of immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. For her sins have piled up high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. If you go and look at the end of Revelation 17 and Revelation 18, you will find not just the demise, but you'll find out what God does in bringing down the commercial and the business and the achievements of man at the end of time. Revelation 18. So we see this in the example. That's just one of the examples through Scripture of mankind trying to build monuments to himself. Now, what's the problem with that? Okay, let's say maybe you're an architect. I don't know. Maybe you're a builder. Well, what's the problem with building buildings like? What's the problem with this big statue? Any problem? No, it's not sinful in itself. We were looking at that in the last hour. But the problem is that mankind has a built-in tendency to want to worship. Every person is born with this. Worship something, somebody. And most often, if God is not the central part of worship, man will end up worshiping something else. And most often, that's some kind of form of his own achievements. That's what you see happening here. You have the command to worship seems to be the problem with what's going on here. So the first thing you see, I'm just going to call it a war zone. In verse 2 it said, then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble. So he's going to bring all these people together. My friend, that's the world in which we live. People still want to congregate, still want to come together to what? To celebrate our own achievements. That's what he was doing. That's not just this one little slice of time. I think that's indicative of what mankind does. We want to come together and celebrate all that we have done. Mankind on his own, we've seen this numerous times in Romans 1, takes the word of God, puts it down, ignores God's revelation to him in the heavens and in his conscience, takes it down, so God says you're without excuse. Ephesians 2, verse 2 says, you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, which is whom? That's Satan himself, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. From the rebellion of Adam in Genesis chapters 1 through 3 until the end of time, mankind is pitted against God the whole time. We see it in Genesis. We see God will bring it to an end in the book of Revelation. 1 Peter 5:8 tells us something about what goes on in our context today. It says, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Why? Because your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Now, I'm not going to develop the whole doctrine of Satanology today, but I'm going to say Satan is a demon. He is a created being. He doesn't have the power to read thoughts. So he's limited. We know that he has to get permission to do anything he does. Look at the book of Job. He can't go any further in doing anything he does to deceive the nations or people of the world other than what God has given him the power to do, but he's a very real entity. So he's the prince of the power of the air, influences people through satanic words and thoughts that he gives to people, and that's the realm in which we live. That's why all these people would come together and say, ooh, big time, Nebuchadnezzar. Let's go and look at what you've done. Isn't it wonderful? Look who we are. We're Babylon. We're Babylon the Great. We're the greatest kingdom on the face of this earth, which they were at the time. My friend, it just tells us that we have this innate ability to confuse the things that are really important in this world. Gordon Dahl has said this about how we confuse this. And most middle-class Americans, this is really profound, so see if you can follow it. Most middle-class Americans tend to worship their work. And they say, well, I don't worship my job. Well, you may not worship it, but obviously we need to work. Some people, especially in the day and age when people do anything they want to do work-wise, some people, almost devoted slavishly to the work. Most people tend to worship their work because it's where they get not only their livelihood, but their strokes. They tend to work at their play. Is that not true? We work at our play. We're so prone to recreation and hobbies. I mean, we've got to go out and sweat it out and do everything else because we're recreating. We're having a good time. We've given to leisure, as if that's some endemic good in that. Timothy says there really isn't, by the way. And we tend to play at our worship. And let me read the whole thing again. They tend to worship their work at their play, and play at their worship. That's profound. So when we understand that Satan's the prince of the power of this air, when we understand that from the very beginning there's been this tendency of mankind to set himself up as this great intellectual and powerful and commercial being that results in this entity called Babylon the Great at that time, we realize, well, nothing's changed. That's the world that we live in now. That's the zone, that's the war zone. That's our world, okay? But note something else here. In this march to the command to worship. Second thing, I look at this passage and said there's a subtle invitation. And I say subtle because it is. In verse 2 it says, then Nebuchadnezzar, the word sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of their provinces to come to the dedication of the enemies that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Hey, y'all come. We're having a party. It's a huge block party. There's going to be music, there's going to be dancing, there's going to be food court, there's going to be jesters, there's going to be all. Come on, everybody come assemble. There's going to be a great convocation of everybody that's anybody in our culture. All your leaders are going to be there. All the prefects, all the governors, all the magicians, all the city council members. Everybody is going to be there. So everybody, y'all come. Now, I'm not reading this as a mandate. I'm just reading this as something that seems to point out that which is natural and normal. There's a subtle invitation that the world gives to come and participate in their system. And we notice here that initially this is not a call to do away with their religious heritage. This is just a statue. And almost say it's like flying the Babylonian flag was just about similar to what it was. But notice what happens. That's the first step. You live in this war zone. Satan is the prince of power of the air. And there's this natural and constant inclination of the world to say, hey, y'all come, let's all participate, let's all get in this together. But we have to understand that it is subtle, and if we see the process that's going on, when we come and we're invited to be a part of the world system that is not governed by God, that will not people eventually to God, but is governed by the prince of the power of the air, we have to at least always be wary, question marks, be cautious. A guy named G.K. Chesterton, who was a British, he was kind of a journalist and a philosopher, a number of years ago said this: trouble when people stop believing in God is not that they thereafter believe in nothing, is that thereafter they believe in anything. My friend, that's what happens when the allure of the world, hey, y'all come. We're going to have a party. Hey, it's all going to be fun and games. Let's all gather together and let's worship the God of our own making. Let's all gather around the flag. Let's all gather around the throne. Let's all gather around what man has done. Let's look at this and see how wonderful it is. I think I've said that. You know the place where I see that the most? And I love sports, and I frankly love to watch the Olympics, but you know where you see in the beginning and the ending ceremony of the Olympics. On one hand, it is one of the biggest worldwide convocations of mankind coming together to look at who are we, look at what we are. There's not one mention of any God, of the true sense of God, in any of that. They come with all these weird kinds of things from the indigenous culture that's there at the time, and all this wonderful technology and all that goes on. It goes on for hours at a time. That's just nothing but a pan of praise for the mankind that made them. Look who we are. So that's what's going on there. So there's, first of all, we see that's in this context of this world that we live in that is not friendly to God, where Satan is the prince of the power of this air. Now we see that there's a subtle invitation. Hey, y'all come, we're going to have this big party, but now look what happens. Third thing is there's compliance to that. Verse 3 says they all came and they stood before the enemies that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Okay, again, is this an indicator of what happens? Is it a mandate? I think it's just an indicator. I think it's just a reflection of, in this particular time, the natural progression of mankind. We're all built, if you want to know, to go along with what everybody else is doing. We're almost, the pressure to comply is overwhelming. We live in a world that says you need to go along to get along. Hey, just do what everybody else is doing. We're all having a party, all having a good time. You're trying to interject in that there's a God and see where that gets you. You're trying to interject in that Satan is the prince of the power of the air, and you see where that goes in a polite dinner conversation. Not far. But see, there's a natural inclination of all the prefects, the governors, the council, all these people, they all come, we're all going to have, and they comply. And you realize in the end of time, when we see what happened in the book of Revelation, mankind will comply with the orders and the edicts of eventually the world rulers that call them to their own destruction. It's just something that happens when a culture together listens to the rage of the age and they all bow down and do what they say. I'm not going to make comment much more than this, but COVID taught us that. COVID taught us that. In my estimation, we listened to the leaders of the age, that the byproduct of that was to destroy much of what went on, especially in our schools, shut down businesses, was something ended up not being what they said it was. We comply. But you see, Daniel was different than that. Daniel had made up his mind. We saw this last week. Daniel made up his mind he wasn't going to comply. Remember when Daniel came last week, it was on Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, he said, Daniel what? You remember last week? I'm not going to ask you to remember last week, but if you remember last week, what did Daniel do? He made up his mind. So here's this 15-year-old kid taken away from his family, 14, 15 years old, and he's thrown into this mix of all this stuff from the greatest culture on the face of this earth at this time, and they're throwing it all at him, and Daniel said, made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. Again, we suggest the reason he wouldn't is probably because, number one, the food had no doubt been offered to the idols of the time, and number two, because it was not on the list that the Jews had, that was an acceptable diet for them. So Daniel said, nope, I'm going to serve I'm not going to participate. How do you protect yourself against compliance? Listen to last week. Make up your mind in advance. Make up your mind. That's the passage I read in Deuteronomy. That's what Phil read about the prophet of Baal. Make up your mind. Joshua faced the same thing. You remember the book of Joshua in 24:15, it says this, if it is desirable in your sight to serve the Lord. Joshua had seen not only people led out of captivity, but he'd seen the rebellion a number of times, right? He'd seen that. And he knew the people that came out of captivity in Egypt, one by one, fell in the desert because they disobeyed God. And God said, fine, if you're not going to follow me, you're just going to wander in the desert for 40 years. Joshua had seen all of that. And now as they're coming into the promised land that God said, I'm going to give this land to you. If we can envision this, here's Joshua. Now Moses is dead, right? Joshua now has the mantle of leadership. Between 2 and 3 million people in this group of people wandering around the desert. 2 to 3 million people. And Joshua stands and says, listen, if it's disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, then choose for yourself today whom you will serve. If you don't want to follow God, choose who you are going to serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served, which are beyond the river, or pick some other gods, the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you're living. You remember, he had this idea of all these gods around them. And if you have any time at all to go and search out the gods of Chemosh and the Ashtoreth and Baal and all these gods of all these pagan cultures around them, my friend, don't think they were just innocent, different religions. When we talk about pagan religions, they're pagan for a reason. It's not just they don't honor the God, but they end up in destruction. All of them do. You read those religions and you study what they did. I mean, they just got involved in heinous stuff. The Bible says even they were involved in these centers they would send up to worship, and there would be male and female cultic prostitution. Go to church, hire a prostitute. And the worst was that these people, all of them eventually killed their own children as a way to pacify their gods. All of them. You want to see them detestable, you do a study in any one of those gods, on Dagon or Baal or Chemosh or any Astarte. You look at this, they are grotesque looking manifestations that people made up. They weren't real, obviously, but gross manifestations of the God of reproduction, the God of plants, the God of rain, the God of rocks, the God of everything. So it's almost like Joshua says, okay, you worship any one of those. Line them all up. What do you want? Pick your God, worship who you want, but you remember, what did Joshua say next? As for me, in my house, we're going to worship the Lord. That's what it takes. You got to serve somebody. You will serve somebody. There's no such thing as being neutral in this war zone. Jesus said what? If you're not for me, you're against me. There's no neutrality. You either are participants with all the prefects, with all the governors, with all the magicians, with all the people that come and bow down. Wow, look at this. Mankind is wonderful. We will look at the gods of mankind. Today, they're not called idols, but it's the god of politics, right? We're seeing this. We've got another 3.5 weeks of the political thing. Some people worshiping whatever. It's the god of politics, or it's the god of academics, or it's the god of business, or it's the god of immorality. So much of what's going on today in the political struggle is nothing more than the god of absolute flagrant immorality. And people they're not only just tacit, they're writing it down on their platform of the political platform. That's what we believe in. So you make your choice. Do I want to follow that? Pick your God today. We have them. They're not called these, but same thing. Pick them or make your determination. For me, my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Exodus chapter 23, God even told the children of Israel as they come into the land, said, listen, you come in the land, these people that I mentioned, all these gods, I'm going to give you, but they're not to come in and live with you. They're not to come in and live with you. Why? They will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. That's eventually why the nation of Israel lost their whole identity, because they bought these other gods. One at a time, you'll see it in their history. They started that god, they pulled in that god. Well, let's be friendly, let's pull in this one. And they started to bow and comply with the ethos of the age that said we have to go along to get along with all these people. And they eventually began to intermarry with them. So they adopted the culture of these people they intermarried with. God says, that's not what I had in mind for you. You see, all of it, to some extent, that's some of the lessons we learn from some place like Daniel, some of these other places. We learn that we all face the power of the prince of the power of the air that's in this war zone in which we live. It's in the air. That's just what's there. Has been since the time of Adam. So when the serpent, Satan himself, came to Eve and said, has God really said? She was deceived. So when we hear a London journalist talk about this Christian politician, well, is God really? We really don't believe that stuff that God said. See, that's nothing new. It's been going on for thousands of years. So it's a choice that is one. So we're involved in this world, in this war zone. We come, the natural inclination, if you're in this world, is to bow down and comply. But then what happens when you do that? Eventually, the call of mankind, the call of worship, eventually this neutrality will be abandoned. Look in verse 4. So I'm back in Daniel chapter 3, verse 4. It says, then the herald loudly proclaimed. By the way, that word herald, just a little sidelight, is the word we get the New Testament word to preach from. Just a little sidelight. A preacher is a herald, just saying, here it is. Come and listen. So the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given. Ooh, I thought we were just being invited. I thought we were just gathering. I thought it was just kind of a big block party. Well, that was the subtlety of the invitation. But now the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, in other words, we've got this huge orchestra, we've got this huge combination rock band orchestra out there in front of you. As soon as you hear the music begin to play, you're to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. Can I just interject a little principle here? We need to know this. You can never go halfway with the world system. There's no such thing. That's why Jesus said, you're either with me or you're against me. You're either on my team or you're not. You got to serve somebody. You got to make up your mind. You can't go all the way with the world system. You can't just kind of be subtle. You're subtle and you kind of get in it. Well, I'll go and I'll just, tip my hat a little bit. If you do that, you're not with God. There is no DMZ. What's DMZ? It means demilitarized zone, right? That was one of the things they're still trying to hold on to in North and South Korea. Here's the South Koreans and North Koreans, supposedly this DMZ. Same thing in Vietnam. They had this supposed place in the middle where there was no fighting. And there's no fighting there. Well, it doesn't work, number one. But there's no spiritual DMZ, my friend. There's no place to hide. You can't go and escape the onslaught of this world and remove yourself from it. I remember when I was in seventh grade. Anybody remember this? Seventh grade, we played dodgeball. Now, when I was that age, junior high was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. They had K through 6, and then you got in junior high 7th, 8th, and 9th. 7th grade boys are not the epitome of manliness. They are skinny, little worms of people that are like pre-men, but they're not there yet. But by the time you get in 9th grade, some of those boys are men. The voices have dropped. All of a sudden, they've got shoulders and arms. We played something called dodgeball. And I tell you, in the gym, you did not want to be where the 9th graders were throwing the balls. They could wipe you out. And if a 9th grader on the other side had the ball, I mean, you went to hide. You're looking for a DMZ. You said, I want to escape here. And then when you got to be a 9th grader, then it got to be a little more fun. But you see, we can't dodge the dodgeball. Can you? You can't dodge it. You just live in the world, and it come flying at you. The New Testament, Paul says, they're the fiery darts of the evil one. They've come firing at you all the time. You can't escape. That's why there's an eventual call to bow down and worship. Just get with the system. And eventually, see, that will always end in ultimate coercion. Look in verse 6. But who does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image of Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So here you have this musical bagpipe. Play the song. As soon as you hear it, bow down and worship. We have this mistaken sense of neutrality. Today, even in the world, it's called secularism. We have this idea that there's a secular world in which everybody's views compete and they're all the same. It's just this natural DMZ. You want to know something? Secularism will always develop into a system that will kill people who oppose it. Always has, always will. We want to experiment with this thing called socialism. That's a nice word that's prelude to communism. You know, under the guise of socialism in the last 100 years, there have been over 20 million people been killed under the guise of socialism and secularism. You can't take God out of the equation and not escape this. You've never been able to do that. We'll never be able to do this. That's what it was at those times. That's what it will continue to be. So we come today and we're asked to listen to the bagpipe. When the scientific gods speak, we're to bow down and agree with them that nothing plus nothing equals everything. When the sense of morality speaks and says you can cut out a baby in the womb of its mother or scald it to death through a saline solution injected into the womb of a mother, we're supposed to bow down and worship it. When the LGBT, when the trans community says that we are to deny the very even molecular makeup of men and women and be whatever you want to, we're to bow down and worship it. When we then come to the psychologists and they say, well, there is no God, so let me give you the answers that we think will help you adjust to your world, we're to bow down and worship. And if you don't, if you dare to stand up and say, I think there's a different view on this truth, what's it called today? It's called misinformation. Oh, well, I don't want to be guilty of misinformation, so I'll just kind of zip my lip, pretend like God's not real, and just go along with everybody else. Eventually, though, there's a cost to that, and that's the last part I want to look at here. The cost of worship is something we see that happens there. First of all, I'm going to use some current terms because I think it's exactly what happened. The first term I'm going to use is if you fall into this pattern of worship, you will be canceled. Look in verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans, those are the Babylonians, came forward and brought charges against the Jews. Now, don't forget, the Jews are bringing charges against the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. There's a memory said last week, the only ones that are mentioned. There may have been others, but we don't know. But 10,000 taken captive. There were 9,996 that aren't mentioned. So at least we know it was these four men. They came and they brought charges against him. Listen, here's another principle. There is no fellowship of darkness with light. Scripture is very clear. There's no fellowship. You're with me or you're against me. It's either darkness or it's light. That's all there is. There's no gray in between. So when the call comes to worship these things, that's what everyone was expected to do. Many people today almost have this idea that the American dream, especially for Christians, that we can just come along and cruise along and it's easy peasy. I mean, we're just going to cruise through life and God's going to bless us and bless the country we live in, and it's all just easy. We're living in an age that's easy to be deceived about that. But that's not historically the way it's always been. And we're seeing that come to an end, I think, in our culture today. So you don't just buy into this and just cruise through life. Matthew 6:24 says this, no one can serve two masters. Nobody. Either you'll hate the one and love the other. That's what Jesus said. You're either with me or you're not. You'll hate one, love the other. You'll either hate God and love the world. Well, no, I'm kind of friendly with God. I like God. Yeah, but not enough to have him control your life. That's when Scripture says you hate him. He's just a good luck charm. Put it on a cross and put it around your neck. That's all he means. Either you're going to hate one and love the other, or you're going to love one and hate the other. So when we see this, Jesus ends that verse saying, you simply can't serve God and wealth or the man's system. You just can't. So you will eventually be canceled. That we shouldn't expect anything else. That's what happened here. That's what will happen. Secondly, you will not be tolerated. Look what happened, verse 11. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a blazing fire. There are certain Jews, O king, whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely, have their names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, by name, O king, have disregarded you. They have turned down your invitation to come to the party. They said, no, thank you. We don't think all those things you're doing there lead us to God. That's just a man elevating himself. We're not going to come to that party. King, you need to know their names, their addresses. They doxed them. Here's where they live. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. We live in this day of what? Hopefully that there's some kind of diversity. You know what diversity means today? Really behind the whole issue of diversity, it has nothing to do with ethnic diversity, color, skin. It has everything to do with philosophical diversity. That's really the goal behind the diverse conversation today. Throw out God and you can believe anything you want. Anything and everything. That's diversity that our world wants. But there's no diversity, my friend, in the kingdom of God. You're either with him or you're against him. So when we see that you won't be tolerated, we shouldn't be too amazed because that happened here. Jesus said, don't be amazed when they hate you. They hated me first. We'll also say they'll be singled out. We already said they'll mention their name. There are certain Jews who have appointed this. They gave their names. They've disregarded you. They don't eat the things that you want them to eat. They don't come to the party. So those people should not be a part of our, quote, polite society. Now, my friend, we're living in an age and in a country that so far protects the rights of each individual. But you realize how much those are being called into question today? Being called into question all over the place. So that these people were told, and you can read almost in any week that you want to read the news accounts or somebody singling out, those people should be eliminated. Those are some of the words that are being used even today. They should be re-educated, and the other people should be eliminated. You know what that means? It means God's people. You know, the one institution standing in the way of this gigantic, orgasmic world party is the church. That's the only thing standing in the way. The academic world is given way, the political world is given way, the business world is given way, the psychological world is given way. What's standing in the way of this? The church. We'll be singled out, and lastly, we will be hated. It's not last, but in verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these were brought before the king. Again, we're kind of amazed that these things would not be happening today. And Jesus did say, don't be amazed when this happens. You guys, I'm not saying this a prophet of doom. We should start going around looking around for everybody hates us. But the world system of which Satan is a prince of this power of this air that goes on, cannot stand the Christian influence. Can't stand it. You bring the word Jesus into a dinner conversation, and you see how far it goes. You say there's such a thing as sin, you'll be laughed out of the conversation. But that's what God says. So the world doesn't want anything to do with that because that's not their God. And if you don't stand for their God, you will be hated. And then lastly, they will come for you. There's a guy that wrote a book a couple of years ago that said, that's where I got that, they will come for you. Verse 19 and 20, I don't think it's reading into it, it's just saying here's what happened. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage. You can imagine that's the teeth-gnashing rage. His expression was altered towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. That was their instantaneous, there is no judge and jury, there is no delay, it's instantaneous judgment. So that's what heated up. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in the army up to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. So we look at that and say, that's a horrible thing. But again, what's going on? It's going on, you have this egomaniac who said to worship me. He's got all the people on his world all coming together and invite him to this big party. He said, okay, but now when you come, there's no illusions here. You're going to have to come and bow down and worship the world system, all of you. And if you don't, there's a price to pay. We don't live in that yet. But it's not too far back in our recent history we can find examples of possibly some of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers that did live in that. I'm referring to pre-World War II Germany. Pre-World War II Germany, however you think that Hitler came to power, eventually came to power as the hero of the people, and he had this huge orgasmic party with the German people, say we're just like Nebuchadnezzar, we're the new Aryan population is going to rule the world, and they believed it. Now, there were some early on that said this guy is an egomaniac. But it got to be the place you couldn't go against that. Nobody could. And eventually, even the ones that didn't, you read some of the generals understood early on, this guy's nutso. But you can't stand against him. By the time he gets the ball rolling, it was just rolling so fast that everybody had to bow down and worship. What was the only thing that stood in Hitler's way? It was the church. And it wasn't the confessional Lutheran church, which it should have been at that time, but it wasn't. It was what was called the confessional church. There were some pastors that began to say, this isn't right. And they saw this world system for what it was, egomaniacal, and eventually ending in death for all who stood against it. We know about the 6 million Jews, but during that time you realize the same thing was going on in communist countries where, as I said before, there are now accounts of over 20 million people that were killed in pre-World War and World War Europe during that time. 20 million were killed during that time. There's a pastor by the name of Martin Niemöller. He was a Lutheran pastor, was part of these, what was called a confessional group of pastors. And you find some interesting accounts of some of them even confronting Hitler in person, face to face, saying, you may have charge of the culture, but we'll take the church. Thank you very much. There was a time of Hitler staring down Niemöller and just turned on his heel and walked out when Niemöller said that to him. Here's what Niemöller said. It's in Germany, they first came for the communists. Remember, they ended up fighting them Russian communists. And I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. And then they came for the Jews. And I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for the trade unionists. And I didn't speak up because I wasn't a union member. And then they came for the Catholics. And I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. And then they came for me. And by that time, no one was left to speak up. So if you want to look at a recent historical example of this thing that's happening here, all you have to do is go back in our most recent history in pre-World War II and see that it happened exactly that way. So I'm not projecting anything in America, but I'm not, can I say that? I'm not projecting it. I'm looking at Daniel as endemic of what the world is like and saying this is a template, this is somewhat of a story, it's somewhat of an explanation of the nature of man and a group of people that did not stand for what man was doing and what happened to them. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel were all thrown, the three were thrown into the fiery furnace. Now we're going to come back, we're not going to leave them there. We're going to talk about that next week, okay? So it's important for us to see. But let me just close by saying this. What I remember I read from Matthew 6, no one can serve two masters. Last week he said, you got to make up your mind. You guys, I'm either going to serve God and I'm going to exist in this world. I understand we can't pull out of this world, right? So students, don't pull out of school. Don't pull out of your jobs. Don't go away and live, like a hermit in a cave. You still have your job. Still do your jobs. Do them well. Do them with the way God has called you to exercise your abilities to do that. Do that, but just remember, this is the world we live in, and be engaged in it. Teddy Roosevelt, I don't think he was a believer, but he wrote a very famous saying that I think is appropriate here that many of you have probably heard, but it's called In the Arena. He says this, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the door of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there's no effort without error and without shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of his achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Politically spoken, but great truth. My friend, we're in the arena. What do you do if you're in the arena? The first thing you do is you acknowledge, who am I going to serve? Is it going to be God in heaven? By that I simply mean this. Do you understand your position before God? Do you understand that there is a God? He's revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ that came to the earth historically, lived on this earth, a perfect life that no one could look at and say he failed or sinned in any way, but that was willing to go to the cross as God in the flesh and willing to give his life, give up his life blood, so that which is the picture of life itself, his perfect blood, could be covering for us, so that when we believe that and we repent of our sin, the Bible says we are saved.